You can wait outside with the contractors because people like you don't sit in meetings that shape a city. The sentence landed in the polished conference room like a steel door slamming shut, and every conversation stopped at once. 30 executives, architects, engineers, reporters, and government staff turned toward the tall black man standing near the entrance wearing a simple charcoal polo, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. No expensive watch. No security detail. No custom suit. Nothing about Darius Coleman matched the image Richard Wallace expected for the lead investor behind the largest redevelopment project in state history. So the deputy commissioner smiled with complete confidence, convinced he had already judged the situation correctly. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago while a scale model of the new riverfront district sat in the center of the room, surrounded by miniature towers, parks, schools, and thousands of future homes waiting for approval. $500 million of private capital rested behind that model, yet the silence around it suddenly felt heavier than concrete. Darius looked at Richard for several seconds without raising his voice. His expression never changed, and that calm somehow made the room even more uncomfortable. A few city consultants exchanged awkward glances while several officials quietly returned to their laptops, pretending not to notice what had just happened. Richard adjusted his blue tie and pointed toward the hallway. Badge holders only. Delivery crews and contractors check in downstairs. A reporter lowered her pen. An architect slowly removed his glasses. Nobody expected the stranger to smile. I appreciate the directions, Darius answered softly, but I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Richard laughed once, short and dismissive, earning polite chuckles from two department managers standing beside him. Confidence doesn't replace credentials. The words floated across the room as if they had been rehearsed for years. Near the back wall, junior project coordinator Emily Foster frowned and glanced at the meeting agenda on her tablet. The lead private investor's name had been partially hidden beneath a stack of digital notes, but one word caught her attention before the screen dimmed. Coleman. She looked back at the man by the door and then at the massive skyline rendering behind the commissioner. Something felt wrong. The air conditioning hummed quietly above everyone, yet the room seemed warmer by the second. Darius slipped one hand into his pocket and rested the other on the leather chair beside him without sitting down. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't embarrassed. He simply observed every face in the room as though memorizing each reaction. Richard mistook that silence for surrender and stepped closer. Security will be happy to escort you to the correct entrance. Across the polished table, a phone hidden inside Darius's pocket vibrated exactly once. And although no one else noticed the sound, the future of an entire city had already begun to change. Darius Coleman glanced at the phone for less than a second before sliding it back into his pocket as though nothing had happened, and that tiny movement somehow carried more confidence than every title hanging on the walls around him. The conference room overlooked 12 square blocks scheduled to become a new waterfront district filled with apartments, restaurants, public parks, and technology offices, a project city leaders had celebrated for nearly 2 years. Every person inside believed they understood exactly who held the power until the quiet man near the entrance refused to react the way they expected. Richard Wallace folded his arms and turned toward the long table where council members and consultants waited with expensive notebooks open and polished presentations ready to begin. "We have important people here," he announced, making no effort to lower his voice. "We cannot delay this meeting because someone walked into the wrong room." Several people nodded automatically, more out of habit than conviction. Emily Foster looked down at her tablet again and expanded the meeting file one line at a time. The first page listed government officials. The second listed engineering firms. The third listed private investors. Her eyes stopped moving when she reached the largest financial commitment on the document. Coleman Urban Development. $500 million. She looked back toward Darius, studying the calm expression that never changed even while dozens of strangers silently judged him. Across the room, a senior architect whispered to a colleague, "He does not look like a billionaire." The reply came just as quietly. "Most real ones do not." Near the windows, a local television reporter noticed the unusual tension and lowered her microphone, sensing that the story in front of her might become more important than the ribbon cutting everyone expected to cover later that afternoon. Richard walked closer until only a few feet separated him from Darius and offered a rehearsed smile that carried no warmth. If you are looking for the construction orientation, take the elevator to the first floor. Darius answered with the same measured tone he had used from the beginning. Thank you for your concern. Nothing more. No argument. No raised voice. No attempt to prove himself. That silence unsettled the room because confidence without explanation forced everyone else to fill the empty space with their own assumptions. Emily finally stood from her chair and quietly approached the assistant seated beside the projector. Can you zoom in on the investor page for a second? She whispered. The assistant hesitated but touched the keyboard anyway. The document appeared across the giant presentation screen for only a moment before disappearing again, yet it was long enough for Emily to read the complete name. Darius Coleman, lead strategic partner, final approval authority. She felt her heartbeat quicken while Richard continued speaking with absolute certainty, completely unaware that every confident word was pushing the meeting closer to a mistake that could not be quietly erased. And somewhere inside Darius's pocket, the phone vibrated for a second time before becoming perfectly still. Emily Foster felt the color leave her face as she stared at the investor list one more time, hoping she had misread the name, but every letter remained exactly where it had been before. Darius Coleman, lead strategic partner, final approval authority, $500 million in private funding connected to the quiet man standing only a few feet away, while Richard Wallace continued speaking with effortless confidence. Emily looked toward the assistant at the projector and whispered, "Do not close that file yet." The assistant glanced at the screen, then at Darius, then quickly minimized the document again as if hiding the truth might somehow delay it. Richard tapped the conference table with a folder and smiled toward the gathered officials. We have spent 18 months preparing this project. We are not going to waste another minute entertaining someone who wandered into the wrong meeting. A few nervous laughs floated through the room before fading into uncomfortable silence. The television reporter slowly lowered her camera and focused entirely on Darius, noticing that he had not once attempted to defend himself or announce his accomplishments. He simply stood with relaxed shoulders and steady eyes, almost as if he were patiently waiting for everyone else to finish revealing exactly who they were. A transportation consultant leaned toward a city attorney and quietly asked, "Has anyone actually verified his credentials?" The attorney looked around and admitted, "Apparently nobody has." Richard reached toward the visitor badge hanging from Darius's jacket and shook his head. "This temporary pass only allows lobby access. Someone made a mistake." Darius carefully removed the badge himself and placed it on the polished table between them. "Mistakes can always be corrected," he said calmly. Richard interpreted the response as surrender and turned toward the security desk outside the glass doors. "Officer Daniels, could you please assist our guest with finding the proper entrance?" The uniformed officer walked in, looked at Darius, and then paused after noticing the complete absence of panic or frustration on his face. "Sir, do you need directions?" he asked politely. "No," Darius answered with the same quiet confidence. "I am exactly where I intended to be." Emily could no longer remain silent. She stepped forward holding her tablet with both hands. "Deputy Commissioner Wallace, I think there is something you need to review before we continue." Richard barely glanced at the screen. Later, Emily tried again. "It concerns the funding agreement." Richard waved her off without reading a single line. "The funding agreement is already approved." Around the table, executives who had been checking emails now watched every second unfold without speaking. Even the city attorney stopped taking notes. Outside the windows, the cranes along the river stood perfectly still against the afternoon skyline, waiting for a project that suddenly felt far less certain than it had only minutes earlier. Deep inside Darius's pocket, the phone vibrated for the third time, and this time a small notification appeared across the locked screen with only 4 words that nobody else could see. "Protocol team standing by." Darius Coleman remained perfectly still while conversations slowly dissolved into uneasy whispers around the conference table, and the longer he refused to defend himself, the more uncertain the room became. Emily Foster took another step forward with her tablet held against her chest, as though it contained something too important to be ignored. She looked directly at Richard Wallace and spoke carefully. "Deputy Commissioner, I verified the investor agreement twice. The lead authority listed on the contract is standing in this room. Richard smiled without even asking to see the document. You are new here, Emily. Large projects attract people who enjoy pretending to be important. The words sounded polished, but several department heads no longer shared his confidence. The city attorney quietly reached for a printed copy of the funding agreement and began turning pages one by one. A transportation planner leaned closer, searching the signature page while the television reporter subtly activated her recorder again. The atmosphere had shifted from certainty to curiosity, and curiosity spread across the room faster than any presentation ever could. Darius noticed every movement, but never interrupted. His calm presence seemed to slow time itself, forcing everyone else to reveal what they believed before learning the truth. Emily finally placed her tablet on the conference table and rotated it toward the attorney. A single line appeared beneath the project summary: Final strategic approval reserved for Coleman Urban Development. The attorney adjusted his glasses and quietly read the line again, this time moving his finger beneath every word. Across the room, an engineering executive frowned and whispered, Coleman. That is the company that financed the waterfront district in Baltimore. Another consultant answered, and the transit expansion in Dallas. Suddenly, the simple man wearing sneakers no longer seemed ordinary. Yet Richard refused to notice the growing hesitation surrounding him. He straightened the stack of presentation folders and announced, We will proceed without unnecessary distractions. Emily looked at Darius, expecting frustration, but instead found only patience. He nodded once, as if encouraging her to trust what she already knew. Outside the glass walls, sunlight reflected across the river and illuminated the scale model sitting at the center of the table. Thousands of miniature buildings cast tiny shadows that seemed to stretch farther every second. The city attorney slowly closed the contract folder and looked toward Richard with an expression that had completely changed. Before he could speak, a soft notification echoed from several laptops at the same time. No one opened the message immediately, but every screen displayed the same sender name, Coleman Executive Office. Richard glanced around and laughed quietly. Interesting timing. Darius finally removed the phone from his pocket, looked at the display for a single moment, and slipped it back without answering. Emily noticed one brief line glowing across the screen before it disappeared forever. Verification complete. Awaiting executive instruction. For the first time since the meeting began, the room felt less like a government conference and more like a place where hidden authority was slowly rising to the surface, and nobody could predict what would happen once it finally arrived. Darius Coleman looked through the conference room windows without seeing the skyline anymore, because another building from another year quietly returned to his memory, a place with faded walls and folding chairs where a 24-year-old entrepreneur had carried rolled blueprints under one arm and impossible hope under the other. He could still remember the receptionist glancing at his worn shoes before saying the meeting had suddenly been canceled, even though he had driven 180 miles to present a neighborhood redevelopment proposal. 10 minutes later, he watched 3 white developers walk through the same doors carrying smaller projects and leaving with signed letters of intent. Nobody had shouted at him that day. Nobody had needed to. Silence had done all the work. He remembered sitting inside his old pickup truck parked beneath a flickering streetlight, spreading the rejected blueprints across the steering wheel and making a promise to himself that no community would ever lose opportunity because someone decided success had a certain appearance. That quiet promise eventually became Coleman Urban Development, a company that restored abandoned districts, financed schools, created parks, and hired thousands of local workers across the country. The memory dissolved as the reflection of the modern conference room returned to the glass, and Darius found Richard Wallace still speaking with complete confidence. We have schedules to keep and taxpayers depending on us, Richard announced while gathering presentation folders. This meeting begins now. Emily Foster opened her mouth as if she wanted to interrupt again, but stopped when the city attorney slowly placed his contract binder on the table without saying a word. The reporter noticed the movement immediately and quietly shifted closer. An engineering executive who had spent years negotiating billion-dollar infrastructure projects suddenly became fascinated by the investor list on his laptop instead of the presentation in front of him. The room was changing in small, invisible ways that only patient people could recognize. Darius rested one hand on the back of an empty chair and finally spoke after several minutes of complete silence. Every project starts long before the first brick is placed. Richard smiled politely. That is certainly true. Darius nodded once. And every project ends long before the last brick if respect leaves the room. Nobody answered. Even the air seemed to pause between those words. Emily looked from Darius to the scale model in the center of the table and imagined thousands of future families, businesses, and students connected to decisions being made in that exact moment. The city attorney quietly reached for his phone and read a new message that caused his expression to tighten. Across the table, another executive received the same notification. Then another. One by one, screens illuminated with identical subject lines from Coleman Executive Office, but nobody dared open them before understanding why they had arrived. Darius did not check his own phone this time because he already knew what the message contained. Somewhere across the city, Naomi Brooks and an entire executive operations team were waiting for a single instruction, and the distance between patience and irreversible action had quietly narrowed to only one phone call. Darius Coleman finally reached into his pocket and picked up the phone that had been waiting in complete silence since he entered the conference room, and the movement was so ordinary that Richard Wallace barely noticed it. The deputy commissioner continued arranging presentation folders while speaking confidently about construction schedules, tax incentives, and public partnerships, unaware that every sentence was being measured against a decision that had not yet been made. Darius held the phone to his ear and waited less than 2 seconds before a familiar voice answered. Naomi Brooks speaking. His reply contained only 4 calm words. Initiate executive freeze protocol. There was no hesitation on the other end. Confirmed. Legal has been notified. Finance is standing by. Investor relations is ready. Awaiting final synchronization. Darius quietly answered, proceed. The call ended after less than 15 seconds, leaving no dramatic speech and no visible display of emotion. Emily Foster watched the exchange with growing uncertainty because nothing about it looked impulsive. It looked practiced, precise, and permanent. The city attorney noticed the same thing and instinctively refreshed his email. Within seconds, a new message appeared carrying a high-priority designation from Coleman Executive Office. Across the table, another executive opened an identical message. Then another laptop chimed. Then another phone vibrated. The synchronized sound spread through the conference room like quiet rain tapping against glass until nearly every device displayed the same notification. Richard finally looked up from his presentation and frowned at the unexpected distraction. Can we please focus on the meeting? Nobody answered him immediately because eyes were moving across identical paragraphs appearing on dozens of screens. Emily opened hers and slowly read every line. Effective immediately, all discretionary funding associated with the Riverfront Renewal Partnership has entered executive review status pending governance verification. All financial authorizations are temporarily suspended until further notice. She looked toward Darius, then toward the scale model sitting at the center of the table, suddenly realizing that every miniature building represented decisions controlled by the man everyone had dismissed only minutes earlier. The television reporter quietly lowered her microphone and instead picked up her phone, recognizing that the real story had just begun. Richard forced a smile and folded his arms. Administrative delays happen all the time. This changes nothing. The city attorney finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. Actually, this notice pauses every private capital release connected to the project. An engineering executive slowly closed his laptop. A transportation consultant stopped taking notes. Even Officer Daniels near the doorway remained perfectly still, sensing that authority inside the room had shifted without anyone raising a voice. Darius stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, calm enough to make the silence feel even louder. Sunlight reflected across the river and illuminated the untouched model city on the table, while every executive around it waited for the next notification that would determine whether $500 million would continue moving forward or remain completely still because one quiet phone call had changed everything. Darius Coleman slowly walked toward the center of the conference table where the scale model of the future Riverfront District rested beneath bright afternoon sunlight, and every pair of eyes followed him without a single instruction being spoken. Nobody was checking presentation slides anymore. Nobody cared about construction schedules or ceremonial speeches. Every executive, attorney, engineer, and reporter stared instead at the notifications that continued arriving across laptops and phones with quiet precision. Richard Wallace forced another confident smile and reached for the remote control connected to the presentation screen. "This is only an administrative review," he declared. "We will continue as planned." He pressed the button, expecting architectural renderings to appear, but the display immediately refreshed with a plain white background carrying bold black letters that seemed to drain the color from the room. Project status: Executive Capital Review. Private funding release: suspended. Authorizing office: Coleman Urban Development. No animation followed. No dramatic sound accompanied the message. It simply existed with complete authority, impossible to ignore and impossible to argue with. The city attorney stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backwards several inches across the polished floor. He adjusted his glasses and quietly reread every line before turning toward Richard. "This authorization is legitimate." An engineering executive opened his tablet and found identical language inside the investor portal. A financial consultant refreshed the banking dashboard twice before slowly lowering his hands. The numbers had disappeared from active status. $500 million had not vanished, but every scheduled release had stopped moving forward at exactly the same moment. Emily Foster looked from the screen to Darius and finally understood why he had never defended himself. He had never needed permission to belong in the room because the room itself depended on his decision. The television reporter quietly switched from meeting coverage to live breaking news notes, realizing that history was unfolding without raised voices or public confrontation. Richard looked around, searching for support that no longer existed. "There has to be some misunderstanding," he said, but even he sounded less certain than before. Darius met his eyes for the first time since entering the conference room and spoke with calm clarity that carried farther than any shout. "You believed authority came from the seat at the head of the table. I have always believed authority comes from responsibility." The silence that followed felt larger than the building itself. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Outside the windows, construction cranes remained perfectly still against the Chicago skyline, as if the entire city had paused to hear the answer. Emily slowly closed her tablet and stood beside the investor model without fear. The city attorney picked up his phone and requested an immediate call with the mayor's office. Around the table, executives who had dismissed a quiet man in a charcoal polo only minutes earlier now waited for his next sentence, because everyone finally understood the truth that had been visible from the beginning. Darius had not entered the room seeking respect. He had entered already carrying the power to decide whether the future sitting on that table would ever become real. The silence inside the conference room finally broke when the city attorney's phone rang, and every person nearby instinctively looked toward him instead of Richard Wallace, a small shift that revealed more about power than any title engraved on an office door. He answered quietly, listened for several seconds, and then stood a little straighter before saying, "Yes, Mayor, I understand." The call ended, and he slowly placed the phone on the polished table beside the frozen project documents. "The mayor's office has requested an immediate status report before any public announcement is made." Nobody moved. Richard attempted to recover the confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier. "This is an unnecessary overreaction. We can resolve this internally." His words drifted across the room without finding support. The engineering executives had already closed their presentations. Financial consultants were reviewing contract clauses instead of construction timelines. The television reporter watched every expression with growing fascination because the story had transformed from an infrastructure meeting into a lesson about judgment. Emily Foster quietly gathered the printed agendas and noticed that every version carried the same signature she had tried to show Richard earlier that afternoon. Darius Coleman remained beside the scale model with relaxed shoulders and calm eyes, making no effort to celebrate the reversal unfolding around him. Naomi Brooks called again, and this time he answered on speaker. "Executive review is fully active," she said with perfect composure. "Legal, finance, and governance teams have completed synchronization. All participating institutions have confirmed receipt. Awaiting your direction." Darius looked across the room before replying. "Maintain review status." "Confirmed," Naomi answered, and the line disconnected. The simplicity of the exchange somehow carried more weight than a room full of speeches. Richard slowly lowered himself into a chair and stared at the miniature skyline sitting only inches away, realizing that thousands of future homes, businesses, and jobs now rested on the patience of the man he had dismissed at the door. Emily stepped forward with unexpected confidence and addressed the room instead of a single official. This project was designed to bring opportunity to neighborhoods that have waited for investment for decades. It deserves leadership that recognizes people before appearances. No one challenged her. Even Officer Daniels near the entrance nodded almost imperceptibly while continuing to stand quietly at his post. The reporter closed her notebook and whispered to her producer that the headline had completely changed. Outside the windows, late afternoon lights stretched across the river and painted golden reflections on the cranes waiting for permission to begin work. Inside, authority had shifted so completely that nobody asked Darius to prove who he was anymore. They already knew. They were simply waiting to discover whether the man they underestimated would still choose to build a future for a city that had nearly turned him away before ever learning his name. Darius Coleman walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the evening light settle across the river where steel cranes waited in complete silence. And for a long moment nobody behind him dared interrupt the quiet because the room had finally learned the difference between authority that demands attention and leadership that never has to ask for it. Richard Wallace slowly stood from his chair and looked at the scale model that had represented certainty only an hour earlier, but now reflected something far more fragile. "I made an assumption," he admitted, his voice noticeably softer than before. Darius turned without anger and without satisfaction because neither emotion could build a neighborhood or create opportunity for families who had waited years for investment. Emily Foster remained beside the conference table holding the original agenda, realizing that history often changed through ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. The city attorney cleared his throat and asked the question everyone else was thinking. What will happen to the project? Darius looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes before answering. That depends on whether this city wants partners or appearances. The television reporter quietly lowered her camera because she understood that the most powerful image would not be a confrontation but a conversation. Outside, traffic moved across the bridges while office lights slowly illuminated the skyline, reminding everyone that millions of people depended on decisions made by strangers in rooms exactly like this one. Naomi Brooks called once more, and her calm voice filled the speaker. Executive review remains active. We are prepared to continue or conclude at your instruction. Darius smiled for the first time that afternoon. Resume the project. Several people released quiet breaths they did not realize they had been holding. At one condition, he continued. Every leadership team participating in this partnership will complete community engagement and bias awareness standards before the next phase begins. Every contractor, consultant, and official will be evaluated by how they treat people, not how they recognize titles. Naomi answered immediately. Condition accepted and recorded. The call ended, and the frozen project status disappeared from laptops one by one as new notifications appeared confirming that funding had been restored. The miniature buildings at the center of the table suddenly represented possibility again instead of uncertainty. Emily smiled quietly while the city attorney closed his binder and the engineers reopened their plans. Richard remained still, understanding that forgiveness had accomplished what pride never could. Darius picked up the visitor badge he had placed on the table hours earlier, looked at it for a brief moment, and gently set it beside the model city before walking toward the door. He stopped only once and spoke with the same calm voice that had carried through every moment of doubt. Respect is not a privilege that powerful people hand to others. It is the foundation that determines whether anything worth building can ever stand. No applause followed, yet none was needed because as the conference room fell silent and the skyline reflected across the glass, everyone understood that the $500 million project had not been saved by money, contracts, or influence. It had been saved by a standard that refused to bend for appearances and by a quiet leader who never needed to raise his voice to change an entire room.